Flames tore through the wooden streets of Tokyo like a living beast. March 10th, 1945. The air itself seemed to ignite as incendiary bombs rained down in waves, turning night into a furnace of orange light. Mothers stumbled through the smoke, with children clutched tight against their chests, searching for air in a world that no longer had any. The shriek of sirens dissolved into chaos. Roofs collapsed, rivers boiled, and the capital of an empire dissolved into fire in one shelter. A young mother pressed her child against her chest, praying the shaking earth would spare them for one more breath. She was certain that if the bombs did not kill her, the enemy soldiers who followed would. That was the terror every Japanese mother carried, that mercy had no place in total war. Then came a sound she did not expect: heavy boots pounding against scorched earth. Not the silent death of bombs from the sky, but the unmistakable presence of men, American soldiers. Their uniforms smudged with ash, moved through the wreckage, to the mother's horror. One of them stopped before her shattered shelter. She braced herself for cruelty, perhaps for the last breath she would share with her child. But then the unthinkable happened. The soldier knelt down, extended his arms, and gently lifted her crying infant from the debris. He cradled the child against his chest as though it were his own, turned his back to the burning street, and shielded the tiny body from the storm of sparks and falling beams. In that instant, a paradox was born. The very men who had unleashed fire from the sky only hours before were now the ones carrying children out of the inferno. Mothers who had prepared themselves for despair watched in stunned silence as the enemy became protector. What explanation could there be? What hidden part of humanity had survived in the uniform of a soldier sworn to destroy? The image lingers: the blackened sky above, the glow of flames reflected in tears, and an American soldier walking through rubble with a Japanese infant in his arms. It is a scene so contradictory that it defies every expectation of war. It was not strategy, not propaganda, not politics. It was the raw human instinct to preserve life, breaking through the iron mask of enmity. And so we begin with a question that pierces across decades. Why would the man who rained bombs cradle the child of his enemy? The paradox cannot be understood without stepping back into the cruel fabric of history. By the final years of World War II, Japan had become a fortress under siege. In 1944 and 1945, the United States Army Air Forces launched relentless bombing campaigns across the Japanese mainland. Cities built of wood and paper, crowded with families, became tinderboxes under waves of incendiary bombs. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, one after another. They were reduced to ash in March 1945 alone. Over 100,000 civilians perished in the Tokyo firebombing, the single deadliest air raid in human history. For mothers huddled in shelters, the American uniform symbolized death from above. This was not just fear, it was cultivated hatred. Government propaganda depicted Americans as heartless monsters, demons who would show no mercy if they set foot on Japanese soil. Mothers whispered to their children, if captured, "Bite your tongue and die before they touch you." Soldiers carried cyanide pills. Civilians practiced suicide drills. The enemy was not human, and to expect humanity from them was to invite disappointment and death. And yet history shows a quieter reality hidden beneath official narratives. Amid the ashes, small acts occurred that were never meant to fit into wartime logic. Soldiers, the very same who dropped fire from the sky, occasionally found themselves face to face with the innocents who had survived. A crying child, a woman too weak to walk, a grandmother clutching a broken sandal. These were not targets. They were human lives, fragile and undeniable. One American airman later wrote in a letter home, "We were trained to destroy. But when I saw the baby clinging to its mother, I forgot the war for a moment. It was just a child, no different from my sister's boy back in Kansas." His words, tucked between military reports and censored correspondence, reveal the inner fracture of war. Men ordered to burn cities could still be undone by a single infant's cry. The Japanese civilians, too, lived with a duality. On one hand, their hatred of the enemy was absolute, shaped by the devastation that fell nightly from the skies. On the other, the reality of seeing a soldier kneel to lift a child could not be reconciled with the picture of a merciless beast. For a mother who had expected abandonment or violence, such moments carried the force of revelation. Here lies the bitter contradiction in a time when strategy demanded cruelty Individuals sometimes acted with compassion, and these fragments of mercy, small and unrecorded, carried a power no bomb could match. They became memories that mothers would tell their children, not as tales of propaganda, but as living proof that even in the heart of destruction, humanity could flicker to life. The stage was set. Expectations of tragedy loomed heavy. Every Japanese mother believed she knew how the story would unfold if soldiers appeared, but as the fire raged on and the night stretched toward dawn, those expectations would be shattered. The mothers who survived the firebombings carried an unshakable assumption if American soldiers ever saw them. The encounter would be merciless. They had been told countless times surrender meant humiliation, captivity meant dishonor, and the enemy's only instinct was to destroy. Even in the darkest nights, these women rehearsed the worst outcomes in their minds. A child's cough in a shelter could give away their hiding place. A baby's cry could summon death. So when boots approached through rubble, hearts froze. The silence between bombings was almost more terrifying than the bombs themselves, because it carried the weight of expectation, the certainty that the enemy would finish what the flames had begun. One woman later described in her diary how she pressed her hand against her son's mouth, terrified that the sound of his breathing would betray them. "If the soldiers find us," she wrote, "I will beg them to kill me first so my child does not have to watch." Such thoughts reveal the extent of despair that a mother's only imagined mercy was a quick death. This was the legacy of years of propaganda, fused with nightly terror. And yet, the moment came when expectation met reality, and reality overturned every belief. Instead of striking down the weak, the soldiers bent low, scooping children into their arms as though they were the soldiers' own. A toddler who had stumbled barefoot across cinders found himself lifted high above the burning ground. Another, coughing from the smoke, was given water from a soldier's canteen. Mothers, frozen in disbelief, watched the very hands they had cursed reach out to protect. The atmosphere in those moments was one of suspended time. The bombs still echoed, buildings still groaned under collapsing beams, yet within this chaos, a quiet gesture emerged. The image of a uniformed man shielding a child with his body was so contrary to expectation that it rewrote the scene entirely. It was not a battlefield any longer, it was a human crossing point, where mother and soldier, enemy and protector, shared the same fragile goal to preserve a child's life. Viewers today, accustomed to seeing war in black and white terms of hero and villain, may find it difficult to understand just how radical these reversals were. Imagine preparing yourself to see your child struck down, only to witness instead the enemy saving that child. It was not simply unexpected, it was shattering. Hatred, rehearsed and reinforced for years, cracked in the space of seconds. These mothers, bracing for tragedy, found themselves with tears they had not anticipated, not of grief, but of disbelief. Tears for the realization that perhaps the world was not as absolute as they had been told. And in those moments, history bent slightly, quietly, away from the narratives of hatred and towards something unrecorded in official documents, the shock of unexpected compassion. The silence that followed each bombing run was not peace, but the hollow pause before despair. Mothers who had braced themselves for abandonment were suddenly confronted with something else entirely, the sight of American soldiers carrying children through streets lined with ash. The reversal was almost unbearable to process. Here were the men who had dropped fire on their homes, now walking with infants pressed against their chests, their hands shielding tiny heads from falling debris. To witness this was to feel the ground shift beneath every assumption of war. One survivor later recalled in testimony that she thought her eyes had deceived her. "I believed I was seeing a ghost," she said, "because no enemy would ever do such a thing. But it was no illusion. Time and again, soldiers bent down, picked up children, and guided families out of the collapsing neighborhoods. The gestures were simple, but their weight was immeasurable. The contrast became sharper when mothers remembered their own experiences with Japanese soldiers. Many had seen men of their own army march past civilians without pausing, leaving the weak behind as burdens in the path of retreat. In Okinawa, thousands of families had been told to kill themselves rather than fall into American hands. And yet here, in the fire-lit ruins, Americans carried children who were not theirs, who spoke no word of their language, who belonged to a nation sworn to resist them. The image spread quietly, not through newspapers or radio broadcasts, but through whispers among survivors huddled in underground shelters. Women told each other, half in awe, half in disbelief, about what they had seen. They carried my child as if he were their own. For those who listened, the words were difficult to accept. Could it be true? Could the same enemy who reduced cities to ashes perform such a human act? Rumors took root, carried by the soft tones of mothers' voices, carrying the memory of something unthinkable yet undeniable. This was not mercy calculated for politics. It was not propaganda staged for photographs. These were spontaneous acts, born in the space where humanity overpowered training and hatred. A soldier who had seen death fall in waves from his own aircraft now looked into the eyes of a crying infant and recognized something universal. In that fragile recognition, the boundaries of war blurred. The mothers who saw it never forgot. They had prepared for cruelty and braced for tragedy, only to witness tenderness at the edge of annihilation. For them, the paradox remained a scar that carried both relief and confusion. If the enemy could save their children, what did it mean for everything they had been told about him? The question lingered long after the fires died down, like smoke drifting over a ruined city when the destroyer becomes the protector. What is left of the meaning of war itself? The night of fire turned into a night of tears, for the first time. Some Japanese mothers saw their hardened grief crack into something unexpected gratitude toward the enemy. A woman later wrote in her hidden diary, "I could not believe it. My child was taken from my arms, but not to be lost, to be saved." She wept not from sorrow, but from the disbelief that an American soldier, whose bombs had destroyed her street, could cradle her infant as though he were kin. The power of this reversal lay not only in the survival of the children, but in the emotional collapse it created. Hatred is a shield. It protects the wounded from unbearable confusion. But when an enemy soldier rocked a baby to calm its cries, the shield shattered. Mothers, who had braced themselves for death, suddenly found themselves confronting an unbearable paradox. The man they had cursed could also be the man who saved their bloodline. Eyewitnesses spoke of the tenderness in small gestures, a soldier pressing his canteen to a child's lips, another removing his jacket to cover an infant's bare skin against the cold. These acts were not grand, yet they pierced deeper than military victories. They undermined the very image the Japanese state had worked so hard to cultivate, that Americans were demons, incapable of mercy. Instead, before their very eyes, mothers saw devils transformed into protectors. The emotional climax resided in the vulnerability of children themselves. Infants resting their heads on foreign shoulders became living symbols, mute ambassadors of humanity. No words were exchanged, no speeches were given, but the sight of a child safe in enemy arms spoke louder than any proclamation. This was a kind of soft victory, one that no general had planned, while bombs destroyed Japan's cities. A single, merciful gesture undermined the empire's propaganda more effectively than any leaflet drop. To mothers who had expected cruelty, the act of seeing their children rescued dismantled the certainty of hatred. Viewers today may ask themselves, how would they have reacted? If you were that mother, clutching your baby in the ruins, what would have broken more deeply into your memory, the roar of bombs above, or the moment when the enemy soldier carried your child to safety? The question is not academic. It invites each of us to reflect on how human instincts can sometimes rise above the machinery of destruction. And it asks whether, in the face of total war, individual acts of mercy may matter as much as victories measured in numbers and cities burned. The paradox was complete. Mothers who expected death found salvation in the arms of their enemy, and the enemy, for a fleeting moment, discovered that the power to save could weigh heavier than the power to destroy. As dawn approached and the fires dimmed into smoke, the city's ruins echoed not only with grief, but with whispers in the underground shelters, where families clung together in exhaustion. Rumors spread like embers carried by the wind. Some mothers insisted it was true, American soldiers had carried children out of the flames. Others shook their heads, unwilling to believe, muttering that such stories were born from shock, illusions in the smoke. Yet the witnesses were certain. They had seen their infants lifted into strong arms, felt the strange relief of trust in those they had sworn to hate. The gossip deepened into speculation. Why would the enemy do this? Was it pity, Or perhaps an act to mock them? One old man whispered bitterly that Americans only saved the children so they could parade their mercy later. But the mothers who had lived through it argued differently. They spoke of small, unstageable details, a soldier's trembling hands as he rocked a baby, another removing his helmet to shield the child from falling sparks. Such gestures were too fleeting, too quiet, to be propaganda. They were moments of human instinct overpowering orders. Psychologists later noted how powerful such reversals could be for civilians who had been told every day that Americans were demons. The sight of an enemy protecting their most fragile bond, a child, was enough to fracture deeply rooted hatred. It did not erase the devastation, but it planted a seed of doubt in the narrative of absolute enmity. That seed, once rooted, could grow into something dangerous for wartime ideology empathy. One mother described how her despair shifted in stages. First, she braced for cruelty. Then came the shock of seeing her child in foreign arms. Finally, she confessed to a fragile, trembling thought, perhaps even the enemy is still human. Such a sentence, whispered in secret, was as revolutionary as any battlefield defeat. For us, as viewers, decades later. The question remains, if you had been in that shelter, what would you have believed? Would you trust the rumor of mercy, or dismiss it as impossible in the face of bombs? And if it were your child carried by an enemy soldier, would you feel gratitude, or would the contradiction be too painful to accept? History records battles in statistic sorties flown, tons of bombs dropped, cities reduced to percentages of ash. But in these whispers, in these fragile rumors exchanged among survivors, we glimpse a different kind of history, one not measured in numbers, but in gasps of disbelief, in quiet tears, in the unbearable image of compassion where none was expected. The gossip lived longer than the flames, and in the ruins of Tokyo, mothers carried that memory like a scar, not of cruelty, but of paradox. Morning light revealed what the night had concealed. Tokyo lay flattened, a vast plain of ashes where entire neighborhoods had once stood. The air still smelled of burning timber and oil. Survivors emerged slowly from shelters, their clothes blackened, their faces hollow, clutching what little remained. Among them, mothers held their children tightly, not only because they had survived, but because of a surreal image that had seared itself into memory, enemy soldiers carrying their little ones to safety. The contrast was unbearable. Only hours earlier, those same uniforms had symbolized death from above, the embodiment of destruction. Now, in the fragile calm of dawn, the mother's recollections blurred the line between executioner and savior. They spoke of seeing bayonets gleam under firelight, and of those same weapons turned aside so that arms could carry infants. In that juxtaposition lay the haunting truth of war, that compassion and cruelty could flow from the same hands. Within the same night, one woman, years later, described how the moment reshaped her soul. The bombs destroyed my home, but the soldier who carried my daughter saved my heart. She confessed in a quiet interview. Her testimony reveals how memory does not always align neatly with ideology. The Japanese state had urged civilians to see Americans as devils, yet this mother remembered her enemy as the one who shielded her child's head from falling beams. Numbers cannot capture this contradiction. They tell us that in Tokyo alone, nearly 16 square miles were obliterated, and more than 1 million were left homeless. But statistics, cold and precise, cannot explain how one act of humanity could carve itself deeper into memory than the destruction that surrounded it. In symbolic terms, the image of an American soldier with a Japanese infant became more than a fleeting scene. It represented the persistence of human conscience within the machinery of annihilation. It showed that even in a war where nations dehumanized each other, individual soldiers could resist that narrative with their actions, if only for a moment, and for the mothers who saw it. That single image lived on as a quiet counterweight to the thunder of bombs. When historians look back, they search for strategies, for turning points, for measurable victories. But the mothers of Tokyo remembered something different. They remembered a paradox that words could never fully reconcile, a memory both healing and painful that the destroyer could also be the protector. And so, as the smoke cleared, a timeless question lingered like a shadow over the ruins in the end. What lasts longer in human memory, the fire that destroyed, or the fragile mercy that saved a single child? History often records the thunder, but not the whispers. The official figures of war tell us how many bombs fell, how many buildings burned, how many lives were lost. They do not tell us how a mother's heart shifted in the silence after the flames, or how a soldier's hands trembled as he carried a child not his own. Yet these are the details that linger, fragile but indelible, shaping memory long after ruins are rebuilt. The paradox of that night in Tokyo was not a grand strategy, nor a turning point marked on maps. It was something quieter, almost invisible to the machinery of war, an infant's cry muffled against a soldier's chest, a mother's tears born of disbelief rather than despair. These were moments that cracked open the rigid categories of enemy and victim, revealing instead the shared humanity buried beneath uniforms and propaganda. For the mothers who lived through it, the memory was double-edged. The fire had taken their homes, their neighbors, their past. Yet alongside destruction lay an image of preservation, the sight of their children carried to safety by those they had been taught to hate. In the decades that followed, such memories became stories told softly, sometimes to children, sometimes only to themselves, not to glorify war, but to remind that even in humanity's darkest hour, light could flicker. Perhaps this is the truest lesson the ruins left behind. Cities can be rebuilt, numbers can be archived, but gestures, a soldier's jacket wrapped around an infant, a helmet tilted to shield against falling sparks live on as symbols. They remind us that compassion, however fleeting, carries a force stronger than fire. And so the image endures dawn over a city of ashes, a soldier walking through smoke, a child resting on his shoulder. It is both contradiction and hope, both wound and balm. It asks us to remember that even when nations fall to war, the smallest acts of humanity can bridge the greatest divides.